Hey readers, so I wasn't planning on reading a section of this every time before Johnny, but this next section seems like it fits perfectly with what we just read in Johnny Tremaine. Remember where we left off with Johnny? He and Sylla had gone back to pick up the silver, and he is watching the Minutemen and saying, oh man, you guys don't know what those British redcoats are like, how amazing they are. So I just thought this next section, which is called Lobsterbacks, would give us just a little more information about the British soldiers. So we'll read this one and then we'll get back to Johnny. Lobsterbacks. On Friday, September 30th, 1768, Paul Revere wrote, the ships of war arrived. The soldiers landed on Long Wharf. They formed and marched with insolent parade, drums beating, fifes playing up King Street. The sun shone on their brightly polished boots and shiny muskets. The redcoats were an impressive sight. If I look at my timeline, 1968, we're still after the Townshend Acts. We haven't got to the Boston Massacre, and definitely not to the Port Act, which is when the British came en masse after the Tea Party. But so there were still British soldiers there before all of this other stuff. But it wasn't at all comfortable to be a British soldier. The red wool jackets were hot and itchy. Their white pants were so tight that they had to be put on wet. As they dried, they got even tighter and pinched cruelly. A redcoat had to pass inspection each morning. Washing wasn't necessary, but he had to shave. He had to clean and polish his boots, buttons and buckles. Then he braided his hair in a long pigtail, powdered it with white powder, and dipped the end in animal grease. It smelled awful. Soldiering was a terrible life. Redcoats were paid only about 8 pence, equal to 2 cents a day. If they didn't keep their uniforms clean, they were whipped. A soldier who tried to desert was likely to be executed. Desert means to leave. Sometimes he had to stand next to his coffin while the firing squad took aim at him, and if he escaped, Indians might be sent after him with orders to bring back his scalp. Life in the British Army was difficult, and redcoats were certainly not welcomed in Boston. Girls turned up their noses, men sneered, and little boys ran after groups of red-jacketed soldiers screaming, "Lobsterbacks, bloodybacks, go home!" So let's read these side pieces of information. Sometimes a married redcoat was allowed to bring his wife and children along. They were given a small amount of food. In return, the women cooked, washed, and nursed sick and wounded men. Whenever the redcoats moved to a new camp, their families went with them. Little children were often present when bloody battles took place. The uniform wasn't the only discomfort a redcoat endured. He had to carry all of his belongings into battle with him. Besides his musket balls, and bayonet, he carried a knapsack stuffed with food, blankets, and camping gear. It was a heavy load. A cat-o'-nine-tails was a whip made of 9 knotted ropes or leather thongs fastened to a handle. Soldiers were punished by being whipped on their bare backs. And finally, redcoats received very low pay. To earn extra money, some hired themselves out to farmers and storekeepers in their free hours. It's interesting because it doesn't seem like being a redcoat is a really good job. But yet there's such a great army, and they're very well known around the world about being such a good army. All right, let's get back to Johnny. Section 3. The musket, which Rab did not have, bothered Johnny. However, the soldiers never carried them while loitering about alehouses and wharves or the stables of the Afric Queen. They stood guard with them. They drilled with them. They practiced marksmanship, very badly, Rab said, and now and then over at the foot of the common they executed a deserter with them, but never, not once, as far as Johnny could make out, did they leave them about. Drilling, shooting, marching over, they stacked them at their barracks, and there was always at least a sergeant guarding these stacked guns. Which makes sense. You don't want your enemies getting the guns. Johnny and Rab dropped their voices even in the privacy of their attic when they discussed these muskets. The Yankee gunsmiths were working from dawn to dusk preparing guns, making new ones, but as long as Rab had a weapon and was, after all, little more than a boy, he believed he had no chance for a modern gun unless he got it for himself from the British. "How soon?" Johnny whispered. "Before they march out and the war begins." "God knows," Rab whispered. "God and General Gage. Maybe not until next spring. Armies always move in the spring. But before then I must have a good gun in my hands. A man can stand up to anything with a good weapon in his hands. Without it, he's but a dumb beast. Johnny had never seen Rab so blocked by anything. Apparently, he went through every situation without friction, like a knife going through cheese. Now he was blocked, and it made him restless, possibly less canny. Canny is like smart and tricky, kind of like a fox. One day he told Johnny that he had a contact with a farmer from Medway who was making a business of buying muskets from the British privates and selling them to Minutemen. Rab did not like to ask his aunt for so large a sum. She had little enough to buy food, but she had said weapons before food. That makes me think of how this is how the women are supporting the war. They're not the ones going to fight, but they're supporting their husbands and brothers and sons by saying weapons before food. One morning, Johnny knew Rab was meeting the farmer at market. He knew that the soldier, returning from guard duty, was going absent-mindedly to leave his musket on a pile of straw. It had been worked out. But when he heard yells and shouts from the marketplace and the rattle of British drums calling up reserves, he tore over to Dock Square. He had a feeling that the turmoil was over Rab's gun. He was right. A solid block of redcoats faced out, presenting their muskets at the market people and inhabitants. The captain was yelling to the churning hundreds, "Get back and stand back, good people of Boston. This is our own private affair." "What happened?" Johnny asked an old henwife. "They've caught one of their own men selling a musket to a farmer. Happens he comes from Medway?" "So 'tis said." "Happens they caught more than the farmer and the soldier?" "They caught 3 in all. They're taking them over to the Province House for General Gage." "Gage is in Salem." Hold on, they got 3 people. Farmer, soldier, and for some colonel then. No mob gathered to rescue the 2 Yankees. All by now felt a certain confidence in the British way of doing things. A general or even a colonel had the right to punish a soldier caught selling his arms, and also any who tempted him. Johnny tagged the marching soldiers, but it was not until they returned to the Province House that he saw the 3 prisoners. The British soldier was grinning, and Johnny guessed that he had been put up to the game merely to snare the yokels. The farmer was in his market smock. He had long, straight gray hair and a thin, mean mouth. You could tell by looking at him he had gone into this business for the love of money, not for the love of freedom. Rab had been shaken out of his usual nice balance between quick action and caution by his passionate desire for a good gun. Otherwise he would not have mixed himself up with such a man. Rab himself was looking a little sullen. He was not used to defeat. What would they do to him? They might imprison him. They might flog him. Worst of all, they might turn him over to some top sergeant to be taught a lesson. The informal punishment would doubtless be worse. A flogging is a beating. The Province House was a beautiful building, and as Johnny hung about the front of it, he had a chance to admire it over an hour. It stood well back from the rattle and bustle of Marlborough Street, with its glassy-eyed copper Indian on top of the cupola, and its carved and colored lion and unicorn of Britain over the door. Behind the house he heard others called, and soldiers were hallooing, but worst of all they were laughing. And that was Colonel Nesbitt's boy, bringing around the colonel's charger. There was a large group of people still standing in the street. The hilarity of the British soldiers did not ease their fears as to the fate of the prisoners. Johnny could hear the rattle of the men's muskets as they came to attention, and then, all together, 4 drummers let their sticks fall as one. Out onto Marlborough Street, with the drummers in black bearskin caps first, and then Colonel Nesbitt on horseback, came almost the entire 47th Regiment, surrounding a cart. In the cart sat a hideous blackbird, big as a man, shaped like a man, with his head hung forward like a molting crow. It was a naked man, painted with tar and rolled in feathers. 3 times already the Whigs had tarred and feathered enemies and carted them through the streets of Boston. Now it was the British turn. The redcoats marched. The colonel's horse pranced. The cart, with its shameful burden, dumped over the cobbles. One glance had Johnny convinced this was not Rab. The hideous blackbird had a paunch. Rab had none. A paunch is like a fat tummy. Before the town house, Colonel Nesbitt ordered a halt, and an orderly came forward and read a proclamation. It merely explained what was being done and why, and threatened like treatment to the next buyer of stolen weapons. Then, Colonel Nesbitt was evidently a newspaper reader. The regiment went to Marshall Lane and stopped before the office of the spy. The threat was made that the editor of that paper would soon be treated like the bird in the cart. Then they were heading for Eads and Gill's office. Johnny guessed the Observer would come next after the Boston Gazette, and ran to Salt Lane to warn Uncle Lorne. He jumped into the shop, slamming the door after him, looking wildly about for the printer. Rab, in his printer's apron, was standing on his bench, quietly settling type. "Rab, how'd you do it? How'd you get away?" Rab's eyes glittered. In spite of his great air of calm, he was angry. "Colonel Nesbit said I was just a child. 'Go buy a pop gun, boy,' he said. 'They flung me out the back door. Told me to go home.'" Johnny laughed. He couldn't help it. Rab had always, as far as Johnny knew, been treated as a grown man and always looked upon himself as such. So all he did was hurt your feelings. Rab grinned suddenly, but a little thinly. Johnny told of the tar and feathering of the farmer, and also that he expected in a short time the 47th Regiment would come marching down Salt Lane and stop before the door to read the proclamation about tar and feathering seditious newspaper publishers. And here they come, those dressed-up red monkeys, but they don't dare do anything but stop, read a proclamation, and move on. All right, I know we're almost done, but I'm going to stop there. Two things. Tarring and feathering is what the colonists, the rebels, the Sons of Liberty are doing to Tories. But now it's like Great Britain, the British soldiers are kind of turning it back on the colonists. They tarred and feathered this farmer who was trying to buy guns. And they're saying, we're going to do the same thing to any of the printers who continue to print articles, newspapers against Great Britain. So that's just kind of informational. But here it says, they don't dare to do anything but read a proclamation and move on. Why don't they actually grab Uncle Lorne and tar and feather him? They're threatening, but why don't they actually do it? Because of the people. The people, there's a lot of people. There's more people than soldiers. They can't afford to make the people too angry. When this was over and the troops moved on down the lane to Union, Johnny and Rab stood in the street and watched them. "Luckily," said Rab, "I didn't give my money in advance. I'll return it to Aunt Jennifer." But he still stood in the street watching the stiff rhythm of the marching troops, the glitter of their guns and bayonets, the dazzle of the white and scarlet disappearing at the bottom of the lane. "They'll make good targets, all right," he said absent-mindedly. "Out in Lexington they're telling us, pick off the officers first, then the sergeants. Those white crosses on their chests are easy to sight on." The words frightened Johnny a little. Lieutenant Stranger, Sergeant Gale, Major Pitcairn. Johnny could not yet think of them as targets. Rab could. So Johnny sees them as humans, and Rab is just seeing them as the enemy. So Rab is able to kind of step back a little bit and think about the whole situation, as opposed to Johnny is just looking at them as individual men. Section 4. Back of the lighthouse were apple trees, now heavy with fruit. Johnny and Scylla sat together on a bench. He had missed her that month she had been out in Milton. It was still summer, but everywhere you could smell and feel the coming of fall. It had been an interesting conversation. Madge had run off and married Sergeant Gale, and Ma had been so put out to keep Mr. Tweedy in the family she had married him herself. She said he was too old for me, and she knows he's too young for her, but he's a clever smith, and she's going to hang on to him, come hell and high water. Scylla bent her face over the work in her lap. She was rolling a tiny hem on a tiny handkerchief, one of Miss Lavinia's. "So she's Mrs. Tweedy now?" "Yes, Maria Tweedy. That's not so bad. You know you have to marry someone whose last name goes with your first. For instance, if my name was Rue, I couldn't marry a man named Barb, or if my name happened to be Tobacco, I couldn't marry a man called Pouch or Pipe, or nobody was ever named Tobacco. You don't know. If a southern merchant made a lot of money on tobacco, I think he might name his daughter Tobacco. We make money on codfish around here, and I never heard anyone calling his girl Codfish. You're just being silly." "But I like to be silly. I like to plan things out. For instance, I couldn't marry a man called... Anybody called Priscilla can marry anybody." "No, they can't. For instance, I couldn't marry Rab." Johnny froze. From being mildly irritated but interested, he was a little angry. "Nobody asked you to," he said shortly. "I know, but a girl has to think about things like that. Almost anything can happen to a girl, suddenly, and she has to think ahead so she'll know which way to jump. Rab wouldn't marry you. He's too wonderful." Scylla gave him one of her sweet, veiled glances out of the corner of her eye. That's what you mean?" It was exactly what Johnny meant. "Of course not, but he's not like any other boy I ever knew." Scylla did not look at the work in her idle fingers. She stared off down Beacon Hill. From where they sat, they could see the ocean. I know that, but when you really get to know him, he doesn't seem so wonderful. I mean, he's just as wonderful, but a whole lot nicer. Johnny did not want to ask the next question, but he could not help it. How'd you get to know him so well? She looked surprised. Why, he comes here and takes me walking and buys me sweets, and once he took me to Old South to hear Dr. Warren. Dr. Warren? Rab had never said anything about this to Johnny. It was well enough to say Rab was secretive by nature and couldn't help the way God had made him, but Johnny felt piqued. That means a little frustrated. Scylla noticed the shadow on his face. Priscilla Silsby is poor, but Scylla Silsby is worse. Why did she say that? Remember, Rab's last name is Silsby, so what is she saying here? Johnny's lower lip stuck out. Seemingly without any action of the wind, his fair hair was rumpled all over his head. But Priscilla Tremaine is a fine name, she went on. I've thought about that ever since you came to the shop and Mother told me I had to marry you. I was 11 then. Then they had both been 11. She, a skinny little thing with a gentle face and disturbing tongue. That means she's kind of saucy and sarcastic like he is. Her clothes had always been too big for her because they were handed down from Dorcas. She had had to pin her skirts tight about her waist to keep them on. Pretty and shabby and sweet and sour. Johnny had liked her right off. He had not thought much about what she looked like now, but he looked at her as she bent her face to her work. The little pointed chin settled into the fresh white ruffles around her throat. Somehow her hair was curly around the edges and straight everywhere else. She had a shallow little nose, and on either side of the bridge lay those long lashes which could mock him as well as her tongue. And so pretty, he could not believe it. He was accustomed to staring at Lavinia's light, famous beauty, and to feel a pleasant tingle up and down his spine. And now it was Scylla Lapham, just good old Scylla, that was giving him spinal creeps. When he was 11, he had said he would marry her, if he had to. And when he was 14, he had said he wouldn't take her on a gold platter. He was 15 now, and soon he would be a grown-up man going courting like Rab. Scylla was packing up her sewing. Miss Lavinia will be wanting her tea, and I must get Isana dressed, brushed, powdered, and perfumed to sit with her. One of the soldiers of the 4th Regiment, who were encamped upon the commons, was earning a little money helping at the light stable. As Scylla moved away from Johnny, the groom leaped forward to open the kitchen door for her. Why that mannered monkey bowing and flunking about just because of Scylla Lapham? The red-headed parrot couldn't even talk English right, but he had known what Johnny had not. Scylla was a grown-up lady, and she was pretty. Scylla, Johnny yelled at her, come back a moment, please. She left the groom bowing and smirking. Yes, she said, standing before Johnny under the apple trees. Look here, what's that fellow's name? Pumpkin. That's not a name. Yes, it is. It's his. No girl could be a Mrs. Pumpkin. Nobody ever. There was so long a pause, Johnny's next words sounded awkward. You were right about one thing. Priscilla Tremaine, that's a fine name. He had meant to make it a joke, but as the words left his mouth, it was not. They both stood embarrassed, looking at their feet. Why are they embarrassed? There's a lot going on here. I'm going to ask you at the end about this here. They both looked embarrassed, looking at their feet. Scylla did not answer, but she reached up through the foliage of the tree and picked a little green apple. She gave it to him. I didn't even know winter apples were still so green, she said, and walked off toward the house without a glance for the admiring pumpkin. Johnny put the apple in his pocket. He'd keep it forever. It meant that Scylla really thought Tremaine was a fine name. No, you can't keep even a little green apples forever. It would wizen up or grow ripe or it might rot. Human relations never seemed to stand completely still. This apple, for instance. It might ripen into something better than it was now, or, unromantically, it might rot away in his pocket. He put it on the windowsill and a little superstitiously waited to see what it would do. But Rab ate the apple. Johnny, already jealous for the first time in his life over Rab's taking Scylla out, buying her sweets, and never saying anything, tried his best to quarrel with the puzzled Rab over this apple. Quarrel is kind of argue. It ended as Johnny might have guessed it would. Rab refused to be impressed with his crime. All he had done was to eat a wormy, no-good apple. He'd give Johnny a peck of better ones, just so you'll stop glaring at me. Was it really wormy, Rab? It was. He had been a fool to think of the apple as a symbol of himself and Scylla. So this whole section is kind of fun. I think. Johnny finds out that Rab has been courting, which means a boy or a young man goes to see a girl, trying to figure out, it's kind of like dating now, to see if they could get married. And Johnny's like jealous, right? Because since they were 11, he kind of thought he was going to marry Scylla. So what do you guys think? I want to know two things. Why were they embarrassed? And do you think the apple is a symbol of what's going to happen to Johnny and Scylla? Do you think their relationship is going to turn into a wormy, no good apple? So two things. Why are they embarrassed? And is their relationship going to end up like a wormy, no good apple? What do you think?